Join us for the stage show because we're moving straight on with another guest. And we're looking now, ladies and gentlemen, at the role of women in World War One. And joining me on stage is Dr. Viv Newman, who has been studying this, and there's another book we can talk about perhaps later. The book plug will happen. But yeah, we are looking at the role of women now in World War One, and incidentally, and coincidentally, I guess, because we were talking about gas just a moment ago, Viv, there is a very interesting story which leads on from that.
There is indeed an interesting story about gas and women. And this is to do with a rather exceptional group of women known as the Fannys. And that's short for the Field First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. And these were a group of women who were serving as nurses and as auxiliaries with the Belgian troops in 1915. And they were actually caught up in the first gas attack. What happened very often with the Fannys is that they served as cooks for the Belgian army, and they were up in the sector near Ypres where the gas was being used, and they were busy cooking breakfast, and they couldn't understand, to begin with, why soldiers were stumbling back from the front line, coughing, shivering, covering their eyes were streaming with tears, and very soon the Fannys began to realise that some terrible poison had been released, and the Fannys themselves also began to suffer with the effects of gas. Now, those of you who are here for Sean's talk would have heard about what the soldiers did to try and protect themselves a little bit from gas at the very beginning. They used cotton wool, and they actually peed into the cotton wool and covered their eyes with it in order to try and protect them. Now, the Fannys, it was a little bit difficult for them to pee into the cotton wool and protect their eyes very quickly. So they were always very good at improvising, the group, the Fannys. And so what one of them happened to have with her was what were known as Southall's hygienic towels for ladies. So they covered their eyes with these hygienic towels for ladies, which seemed to work quite effectively as a short-term measure against the gas. And they went on, as Fannys always did, with what the job was in hand, which was cooking breakfast. And they were very proud to be able to say that the troops were given their breakfast at the same time as normal. Now, the British authorities were very interested in what sort of gas masks had been issued to the Fannys to protect them from the gas, and they were too embarrassed to tell the authorities what they had done to serve as a useful antidote to the gas. So the first gas masks for women were actually made out of Southall's hygienic towels for ladies. So that's one of the many stories about the Fannys and the First World War. The nurses were, of course, also involved with gas attacks, and as the war progressed, many nurses were actually given gas masks to help to protect them from the effects of gas. They went through gas training, but they sent letters home saying that they didn't think they would ever need to use their masks. And what a number of them did was the soldiers who they were nursing in the casualty clearing stations would often have lost their gas mask, and so a nurse would very generously give hers to a soldier. The problem was for the women, the nurses, that when they were cutting off when the soldiers came in wounded, if they'd suffered from gas, the women would be cutting off the uniforms, and what they didn't realise was that they were actually getting doses of gas themselves. And we have got stories of women who subsequently died. Very often it wasn't realised what they had died from, and it was put down to, for example, there's a nurse who had her appendix removed, and it was believed that she had just suffered the after effects of the anaesthetic, and subsequent research carried out has actually revealed that she herself died of gas poisoning because her system was actually poisoned by the gas just the same way as soldiers were being poisoned. So we often don't associate women with gas in the First World War, but they also suffered from this terrible, terrible poison that was being used. And the nurses were often at their and the medical profession were at their wits' end as what they could actually do to use as an antidote. And we've got, some of you may well have heard of the poem Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, that starts with the line, gas, gas, quick boys, and ecstasy. and there's the ecstasy of drowning, and they try and cover their heads, their faces with the masks. In fact, if you go back to 1915, there's actually a record of a nurse who wrote about the effects of soldiers being gassed, and you almost wonder whether Owen had read this nurse's lines, because she talks about the men fumbling and how in their dreams they're crying out because they can see the men who are suffering can see others actually drowning in the froth of their own lungs. So you're actually getting the women, in this case ahead of the men, seeing the real effects of the gas. And for nurses, it was something that they lived with every day of their service, and they did not know what to do. There was nothing that they could do to alleviate the suffering.
Viv, apart from being the expert as you are in women in World War One, you've also done a lot of study about women and poetry in World War One. And there's a great Essex connection with regards to poet, isn't there?
There is indeed an Essex connection with poetry, and to begin with, people are often very surprised to hear of women poets in the First World War, because we all associate war poetry with the men, but there was a huge body of poetry written by women. Some of it is actually superb, and we have a local poet, Alexandra Grantham, who lived in Malden, just outside Malden, at Beeley Abbey, and she has a very tragic war story which she explores in her poetry. She was in fact German by birth. She came to Girton, to Cambridge, to study, in itself very unusual for a woman at the time. Met Frederick Grantham, whom she married, and in 1895 their first son Hugo was born. I'm sure you can make the connection between being born in 1895, just the right age to go to war. Alexandra's husband was also a reservist. He was called up and was in France by November 1914. Hugo himself goes off and he's sent to the Gallipoli campaign. And in May 1915, Alexandra receives the news that her husband is missing, believed prisoner. As a German, that probably didn't seem too bad. Maybe there were some strings she could pull. Maybe she could find out that he was all right, or at least make sure that he was well cared for. So she is fairly philosophical, and then she receives terrible news that her son Hugo has been killed on the 28th of June 1915, just a year after that fateful shot was fired in Sarajevo that Sean was talking about. And Alexandra knows there's no hope for Hugo because he is definitely dead. She explores her feelings for him and her grief in a series of poems that she calls Meta Dolorosa. And she works through her grief, her ambivalent feelings about war. On the one hand, her son is her brave son, and he's been mentioned in dispatches. He is a true hero, he is a soldier. But he is also her small boy that she nurtured, that she looked after, that she sung lullabies to as he lay in his cradle. And she has to reconcile this terrible loss, her grief and her pride, and she works through this in her poetry. And then there's a memorial service held for Hugo on August 1915 at All Saints' Church in Malden. She comes home, no doubt in the mixture of grief and pride, and there's a telegram waiting for her. Frederick's body has not been found, but the dog tag has been found near to Neuve-Chapelle. He had laid out in no man's land dead since May 1915. Now she has the grief for her husband to work through, as well as the grief for her son. But a true grief reaction. She's angry with her husband. Why isn't he there? She needs him. He must comfort her. But he's dead. She's very cross with him. She can grieve for Hugo, but she is resentful of Frederick. How dare he get killed? He was too old to go to war. Why did he go? Why isn't he there? She needs him. And she can never reconcile these two losses. She tries to work them through in her poetry, and finally she is resigned to the fact that for women, war will always be a terrible tragedy. The Granthams had actually had another son in 1912. You can do the arithmetic again. 1939, what happens? War breaks out again. Godfrey joins the Royal Air Force. In 1942, she receives the telegram that once again everybody dreads. Godfrey has been shot down. He is dead. Now she has to reconcile a grief for a son who died 30 years ago, 25 years ago, with a grief for her son who has just been killed. Once again, she works it through in poetry, and her final poem to Godfrey is so tragic. She looks at mothers across all nations, and she realises that with old and trembling hands, all they can do is drop a flower into the grave of their lost son. And she sees mothers across the world, mothers who in 2 world wars have had to face losses of sons. Now they are united in their suffering. And Alexandra's story, as her 3 of her beloved men were killed due to the actions of her countrymen, she has an extra grief to reconcile. And she is left realising that the only thing that can happen is war, is tragedy and grief and horror.
Viv, you told that story so well. Don't you agree, ladies and gentlemen? How moving that was. Really was moving.
And
Chance now to mention the book, Viv.
Well, it seems we're all doing a plug for a book. So if you're interested in the stories of the Fannys, or in Alexandra, or indeed any of the other hundreds of women who served their nation in the First World War, we also served The Forgotten Women of the First World War, is being published by Pen and Sword in November of this year. I was going to say November 1914, I actually mean November 2014. And I also have a website, www.firstworldwarwomen.co.uk. So have a look, there's lots of stories up there, stories about gas, the nurse who died of appendicitis but it was actually because of gas, and all sorts of other stories. And if you have stories about your female ancestors, please let me know, because this is an ongoing project.
Dr. Viv Newman, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thank you, Viv.